The night he fell from the sky was one of those moments that divided a life into before and after. The B-17, Silver Duchess, had been limping back from a bombing run over the Ruhr Valley when the flak found her. Lieutenant James Walker had known the risk before he climbed aboard that morning. The way they all did, the quiet handshake with death every man offered when the engines first roared to life. But knowing a thing and feeling it claw at your skin were not the same. The Germans were relentless that day. Searchlights ripped the clouds apart, flak bursts painted the sky in black petals of fire, and through it all the bomber shook like a living thing trying to tear itself free. Walker could smell the burning oil, the sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. The intercom crackled with shouts, men calling out damage report, someone screaming that number 2 engine was gone. He felt the plane shudder, saw the altimeter falling, and knew there would be no returning to England. He gave the order no pilot ever wants to give. Bail out. The words were flat, mechanical, but his chest burned when he said them. When he leapt into the night, the cold tore at him like a knife. The wind howled in his ears, and for a second, he wasn't sure the parachute would open. Then came the snap, the violent pull that yanked him upward, the fabric above him billowing like a ghost against the stars. The bomber below was a streak of flame falling to earth, and for an instant, it looked almost beautiful, like some dying comet trailing its last breath across the darkness. Then it hit the ground. The explosion lit up the horizon, and he felt it even from miles away, a deep, muffled thud that rattled through his bones. He hung in the air, suspended between life and death, watching the fire fade into a dull orange glow that would mark a grave he couldn't visit. He landed hard in a muddy field, the shock driving pain up through his legs and into his spine. The night was silent, except for the wind moving through the trees. No sirens, no voices, just the whisper of distant thunder and the sound of his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. He tore the parachute free, rolling it into a ball and burying it beneath a tangle of brush. His hands were shaking. He could feel the adrenaline leaving him, replaced by the cold certainty of where he was, behind enemy lines, alone and hunted. The thought came to him unbidden. Most men who fell into German territory never made it back. The forest loomed around him, wet and black, the moonlight bleeding through the branches in fractured beams. He moved carefully, each step deliberate, testing the ground before he shifted his weight. His training told him to head west, to find cover, to avoid open ground. But training couldn't account for exhaustion, for the way his body screamed for rest, or for the fear that every snapping twig might be the sound of a boot. He thought of the crew, McKinney, who had just turned 21 and kept a picture of his fiancée taped to the radio panel, Sullivan, the tail gunner, who never stopped humming swing tunes even under fire. He thought of their voices, their laughter, the way the engines had drowned it all out before the fire came. He told himself not to think about whether any of them had made it out. He needed to survive the night first. At some point, he saw lights through the trees, a flicker, then steady. A farmhouse. He froze. Instinct told him to stay away. Civilians could be dangerous. Some were collaborators, and one wrong knock could mean a bullet or a prison camp. But the cold was sinking into his bones, and his left arm hung useless at his side from the fall. He couldn't keep moving. He crept closer until he could make out the shape of the house, the faint glow of a candle behind a curtained window. He watched for what felt like hours, but no soldiers came. No voices in German carried through the night. He finally stepped forward, boots sinking into the wet earth, and knocked softly. The door opened a few inches. A man stood there, gaunt and unshaven, his eyes hollowed by war but alert. He looked at Walker's uniform, the blood on his sleeve, the desperation in his face. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then the man opened the door wider and motioned for him to come in. Walker hesitated, just a breath, a heartbeat. But something in the stranger's expression, something tired and human, told him it was safe. He stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp hay. A woman appeared from another room, her face pale in the candlelight, a child clinging to her skirt. The man closed the door and drew the curtain tight. They didn't speak at first. The man poured water into a bowl and gestured for Walker to sit. He cleaned the blood from his arm, worked in silence. Only after several minutes did he say, in halting English, "You are American?" Walker nodded. The man's jaw tightened. "You must not stay long. Germans search every night." Walker wanted to say thank you, wanted to explain, but the words came out broken. The man cut him off with a gesture. "You rest now. Tomorrow, we think." The pilot sat by the hearth, wrapped in a rough wool blanket. He could hear the faint ticking of a clock, the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the hills. The child peeked at him from behind her mother's arm. eyes wide with fear and curiosity. He smiled, though he didn't feel like smiling. He had fallen into a stranger's world, one where kindness was dangerous and silence meant survival. The man's name, he would later learn, was Henri Duval, a farmer who had lost his brother to the German occupation, who now risked everything to hide the very kind of man the Nazis hunted. But that night, they were just two men sharing the quiet between storms. Outside, somewhere far off, a dog barked, and the air smelled faintly of rain and smoke. In the flicker of the candlelight, Walker's shadow stretched across the wall, long and trembling. He didn't know it yet, but this meeting would change both their lives forever. Where are you watching from? Leave a quick comment below before we move to the next part. Morning came muted and grey, the kind of dawn that carried more silence than light. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke from a dying fire. When James Walker opened his eyes, for a brief second he forgot where he was. The low wooden beams above him, the straw mattress beneath his back, the faint murmur of voices from the next room. None of it belonged to his world of engines, flight maps, and steel. Then the ache in his arm reminded him. He sat up slowly, his vision swimming, and saw Henri standing by the door, fastening a worn coat, ready to face another day under occupation. The man looked at him without a word, only nodding once as if to say, "You're alive. That's enough for now." Outside, the wind hissed through the trees, carrying the faint hum of distant trucks on the road, German patrols perhaps, moving supplies toward the front. Walker moved to the window and watched as Henri walked toward the barn, his posture calm, deliberate, the way of someone who knew every sound might be listened to by the wrong ears. Inside the farmhouse, the woman, Claire, was kneading bread at the table. She spoke little English but motioned for him to sit, placing a bowl of thin soup before him. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until the first spoonful hit his stomach, the warmth spreading through him like forgiveness. The child, a girl no older than 6, sat nearby colouring on a scrap of paper with a stub of charcoal. She looked up at him often, her eyes curious but unafraid now. Walker tried to smile again, though something in his chest felt heavy, as if gratitude itself were a weight. The farmhouse was small, but every inch of it was alive with the quiet rhythm of survival. Boots by the door, buckets by the hearth, dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The walls were thin, the fear constant, but there was a strange peace in their routine. Henri returned after some time, wiping his hands on a cloth, and motioned for Walker to follow him outside. They crossed the yard to the barn, where the smell of hay and manure mingled with the damp chill of morning. In the far corner, beneath loose boards and old sacks of grain, Henri revealed a small hiding place, barely enough space for one man to lie down. "For when they come," Henri said quietly. "Not if, when." Walker crouched, inspecting the space. It was narrow, suffocating, but it would have to do. He looked up and met Henry's gaze, and in that silence, an understanding passed between them, something raw, built not on words, but necessity. Days blurred into one another. The war existed just beyond the tree line, in the low rumble of artillery that sometimes reached them at night, in the smoke columns that rose faintly on the horizon. Walker learned to move only when told, to stay hidden when German soldiers came through the village. He spent hours in that cramped space beneath the barn floor, listening to the muffled footsteps above, the barked commands in German, the metallic jingle of weapons. Each time, he felt the pulse of fear pounding through his throat, wondering if the next breath would be his last. Henri never flinched. He would greet the soldiers with a tired farmer's smile, offer them milk or bread, talk about weather and harvests until they moved on. Only when the last boot print faded did he lift the boards again and whisper, "All clear." In those quiet nights, when it was safe to breathe again, they talked. Henri spoke of his brother, executed for helping resistance fighters. He told Walker that he hadn't meant to get involved that he had a family to protect, but seeing that parachute in the fields had felt like fate, a call he couldn't ignore. Walker listened, and in turn spoke of home, a father who had fought in the Great War, a mother who wrote every week, a girl in Ohio who sent him a photograph with the words, "Come back to me," written on the back. Henri never said much to that, only stared into the fire with an expression that carried both envy and sorrow. As autumn deepened, the war's shadow grew longer. Rumours came through the village, whispered news of Allied advances, of German retreats, of liberation that always seemed just a little too far away. The danger was rising, not fading. Patrols increased. Suspicion grew. A neighbour had been arrested for harbouring a downed pilot 2 towns over. Word was he hadn't lived to see the next morning. Henri knew what that meant for all of them, yet he didn't send Walker away. Maybe it was pride, maybe guilt, Maybe something simpler, a shared belief that small acts of decency still mattered, even in a world built on cruelty. One night, Walker woke to the sound of thunder, or what he thought was thunder. But it wasn't the sky, it was artillery, closer now than ever before. The front was shifting. He went to the window and saw the faint glow of fires to the east. Henry joined him, his face drawn, his eyes reflecting the same uneasy light. "The war is coming here," Henry said. "You cannot stay much longer." Walker nodded. He knew it too, but he didn't know where else to go. Henry promised he would find someone, contacts in the resistance, men who moved through the woods by night, helping downed airmen cross into free territory. Until then, they would wait. In the days that followed, they prepared quietly. Henry gathered supplies, bread, a little cheese, a small pistol with only 2 bullets. Claire mended Walker's torn jacket, and though she said nothing, her hands trembled slightly as she worked. The child left him a drawing before he left, a crude picture of a man with wings, standing beside a farmhouse beneath a bright yellow sun. Walker folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. The morning he was to leave, the forest was still. No birds sang. The air was heavy with the promise of rain. Henry clasped his shoulder and said simply, "If you live, remember." Walker could not answer. There were no words for what passed between them, only silence, the kind that carried both gratitude and sorrow in equal measure. And when he finally stepped back into the woods, carrying nothing but a compass, a scrap of food, and the fragile thread of trust that bound him to the strangers who had saved his life, he didn't look back. Not because he wanted to forget, but because he couldn't bear to. The farmhouse faded behind him into the mist, and the sound of distant thunder followed him west. If this story speaks to something you believe should never be forgotten, take a second and subscribe, so we can keep these stories of courage alive, one memory at a time. The forest swallowed him whole. For days, James Walker moved like a ghost between the trees, guided only by Henry's rough hand-drawn map and the pale flicker of the compass needle. The air was colder now, the kind of chill that seeps through fabric and bone until even thought begins to freeze. He ate little, slept less, and lived on the rhythm of his breath, the whisper of boots through fallen leaves, and the knowledge that somewhere behind him were men with dogs and rifles who would kill him without hesitation. The first night he slept beneath a fallen pine, rain dripping steadily from the branches. He dreamed of the B-17 again, of fire falling, of faces half illuminated by explosions, and woke with his heart pounding and his body slick with sweat despite the cold. He lay still, listening to the silence, realizing that the world was so utterly still now it felt unearthly. Every sound, every creak, every crack was an accusation. By the second day, hunger gnawed at him like an old wound. He drank from muddy streams, chewed on stale bread that Henry had given him, and tried not to think of how far he still had to go. The woods were endless. Once, he saw the distant outline of a village through the mist, the smoke from chimneys rising in crooked grey lines. He dared not approach. He'd seen what the Germans did to those who helped men like him. Farmhouses burned, families dragged into the road, the sounds of boots and screams echoing long after the soldiers left. He skirted the edge of the fields, moving only at dusk. His clothes were soaked, his beard rough against his face, his boots torn open at the toes. He was no longer a pilot, he was an animal, surviving 1 hour at a time. It was on the third night that he heard voices. German, close. He froze, dropping to his knees among the roots of an old oak. The moonlight glinted off metal somewhere through the trees. A patrol, 2 soldiers, maybe 3, their boots snapping twigs, their rifles slung loosely as they spoke in casual tones. He could smell the tobacco from one of them, faint and sharp. They were joking about something, their laughter ugly in the quiet. Walker pressed himself against the earth, holding his breath. The seconds stretched into eternities. One of the men stopped, looking out into the darkness, a flashlight beam slicing across the woods. It passed within feet of where Walker lay. The soldier said something, a short, bored remark, and the beam moved on. Then they were gone, the sound of their voices fading into the distance, leaving only the wind and the deep, wild pounding of his heart. He didn't move for nearly an hour after that. When he finally stood, his knees trembled so violently he almost fell. He pushed onward, following the compass west, but the forest felt different now, alive and watching. Every rustle of branches was a threat. Once, in a clearing, he saw a fox dart across the path, red fur glinting like flame in the moonlight. He envied its freedom. Somewhere beyond those trees, men were dying by the thousands, fronts shifting, battles raging. But here, his war was measured in inches, in breaths, in the faint scrape of a boot, that might mean life or death. By the fourth day, the weather broke. Rain fell in sheets, the sky a flat, merciless grey. He found an abandoned barn at the edge of a field and took shelter inside. The roof leaked, and the hay was damp, but it was enough. He stripped off his jacket, wrung it out, and huddled beneath a ragged tarp. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion. For the first time since leaving Henry's farm, he allowed himself to think of home again. He imagined his mother's kitchen, the warmth of the stove, the sound of her humming while she cooked. He imagined sunlight on the Ohio River, his father's old fishing hat, the lazy buzz of summer days that now seemed like something from another man's life. He tried to remember the name of the song his girl used to play on the piano, the one she said she'd play when he came back, but the melody slipped away from him. Everything did, eventually. That night, he dreamed he was flying again, the engines steady, the sky clear. He could see his crew, alive and laughing. McKinney was singing off-key. Sullivan was cursing the cold. Then a burst of flak bloomed in front of them, a flower of fire, and the dream shattered into the roar of engines and the scream of metal. He woke, gasping, his throat raw. It took him a moment to realize the sound wasn't from his dream. It was real. Trucks, engines, voices, German soldiers moving along the road just beyond the barn. He crawled to a crack in the wall and saw them. 6 men, maybe more, headlights cutting through the rain. They were searching the fields, rifles slung, dogs barking at the ends of their leashes. One of the soldiers shouted, pointing toward the barn. Walker's blood turned to ice. He scrambled to the far corner, pressing himself behind a stack of hay bale. The door creaked open. Boots stepped inside. A flashlight beam sliced across the floorboards. The dog growled, low and tense. Walker clamped a hand over his mouth, praying the pounding of his heart wouldn't give him away. The soldier muttered something, kicked at the hay, then turned away. Another shouted from outside, something about moving on. The boots paused, then retreated. The door shut. The sound of engines started again. He didn't move until dawn. When he finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped, and the fields glistened silver with mist. He felt hollow, as if his body had been drained of everything except the will to keep moving. That morning, as he crossed another ridge, he spotted something in the distance, a flicker of light, then 2 quick flashes. He froze. It could be anything, a reflection, a trick of the sun, but then it came again, deliberate this time, 2 short, 1 long, a signal. Henri had mentioned something once, a way the resistance marked safe points for those trying to reach them. He hesitated only a moment before heading toward it. As he drew closer, the forest opened into a narrow valley where a small cottage stood half hidden by ivy and fog. A man emerged from the doorway, coat buttoned high, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't look German. His eyes were sharp, cautious. But when he saw Walker's uniform beneath the mud and tears, he nodded once. Américain, Walker nodded. The man motioned for him to hurry inside. He followed without question, though his legs barely carried him. Inside the cottage were 2 more men and a woman, their faces hardened by months of fear and fatigue. They spoke in rapid French, arguing softly, until one turned to Walker and said in broken English, "You are lucky. Patrols everywhere. You rest. We send word to Henry. He say you come." Walker sank onto a stool, his vision blurring. For the first time in days, the thought of safety didn't feel like a fantasy. He didn't know who these people were, only that their courage had the same quiet weight as Henri's. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the windows. He listened, feeling his body finally surrender to exhaustion. For now, he was safe. But the war wasn't done with him. It never was. For 3 days, the rain didn't stop. It came down in thin, relentless sheets that turned the world into a blur of grey and movement. James Walker travelled with the resistance through mud, hunger, and the kind of silence that only men used to fear could hold. They moved mostly by night, slipping between forests and farm roads, guided by signals no one ever explained, chalk marks on stones, lanterns that blinked twice from distant barns, coded words exchanged in whispers. His body was failing. The wound in his arm had reopened, his vision sometimes blurred, and every sound, every dog bark or crack of a twig, sent a jolt through his gut. Yet he kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and the thought of Henry's risk, of that small family who had given him sanctuary, pushed him forward. The resistance fighters around him, Pierre, Luc, and the woman called Marie, were hard and quiet people. They carried weapons that looked older than they were, their faces carved by sleeplessness. He never asked how many they had lost. You didn't ask questions like that here. You just walked. On the second night, they came within sight of a German outpost. It was a cluster of buildings near a crossroads, floodlights sweeping the fields, the air thick with the smell of diesel and damp earth. They had to cross the main road before dawn. Pierre whispered the plan in clipped French, and though Walker didn't understand every word, he caught the meaning in his tone. They would wait for the lights to move east, then crawl across the ditch, one by one. No sound, no hesitation. When his turn came, he moved like a shadow, pressing his body into the mud, every muscle screaming for stillness. A truck rolled past, headlights slicing through the dark. The ground shook. He could see the glint of a soldier's cigarette just feet away. The smoke curled upward, and for a terrifying moment, the man turned his head. Walker stopped breathing. Seconds passed, long, unbearable seconds, and then the soldier flicked the cigarette away and walked on. The light moved east. Pierre signaled. They ran. Gunfire cracked through the night before they reached the other side. A shout in German. Bullets tore through branches. Walker dove into a ditch, mud splashing his face. Marie screamed something in French, firing back toward the lights. The air exploded with noise. Rifles, shouts, the distant rumble of engines coming alive. "Go!" Pierre yelled. They sprinted for the woods, the world collapsing into chaos. Walker's lungs burned, his boots slipping on wet leaves. A bullet snapped past his ear, close enough to feel the heat of it. He stumbled, fell, and rolled behind a tree. Luke grabbed him by the collar and dragged him onward. They didn't stop until the sounds faded into the storm. They reached an abandoned chapel before dawn, its roof half collapsed, its stone walls veined with ivy. Inside, candles burned low, the air thick with damp and dust. Walker leaned against the altar, chest heaving. Pierre stood by the door, rifle in hand, watching the road. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Marie broke the silence, whispering, "We lost Luke." The words fell like stones. No one asked how. There was nothing to say. Pierre closed his eyes, muttered something that might have been a prayer, and turned away. Outside, the wind moaned through the broken glass. As dawn crept in, Walker sat in the corner, staring at the cracked crucifix above the altar. The face of Christ was worn smooth, features lost to time, but the eyes, hollow, gouged by age, seemed to stare right through him. He thought of the men he had lost in the bomber, of McKinney's laughter, of Sullivan's quiet bravery, and a strange guilt filled him, sharp and unrelenting. Why was he alive when they weren't? Why him? He had always believed survival was luck, but luck was too fragile a word now. It felt more like theft. That night, they moved again. Their destination was the Loire River, where another group was said to have a boat waiting to carry fugitives toward the Allied lines. The journey was treacherous. Mines in the fields, checkpoints on every road, patrols that shot first and asked after. They walked under a moon half hidden by clouds, their shadows long and distorted. At one point, they found the wreckage of a train bombed weeks earlier, twisted metal, charred timber, the faint stench of something that had once been human. Walker turned away. War stripped the world of faces, leaving only fragments, remnants, ghosts. Near midnight, they reached a stretch of road where the bridge had been blown apart. The only way across was through the river itself, swollen, cold, and black as oil. Pierre went first, then Marie. Walker followed, the current dragging at his legs, the freezing water stabbing through his chest. Halfway across, he slipped, the current seizing him. He went under, the roar filling his ears, mud and stones battering his limbs. Panic flared, his lungs burning, his hands clawing for anything solid. Then a hand caught his arm, Marie's. She pulled with everything she had. Her teeth gritted, and together they staggered to the far bank, collapsing in the reeds, gasping for air. Pierre knelt beside them, his face hard, but his eyes softer than before. "Not far now," he said. "One more night." The last miles were the worst. The cold cut deeper, and the sounds of pursuit never seemed to fade. Twice, they saw lights in the distance, and each time they dropped to the ground and waited, breath held, until the danger passed. When they finally reached the safe house, a crumbling stone mill tucked beside the river, they were half dead with exhaustion. Inside, a man was waiting, his voice calm, his coat bearing the insignia of the Free French Forces. He looked at Walker with something like recognition, though they had never met. "Henri said you were stubborn," he said in English, touched by a French accent. He was right. Walker wanted to ask about Henri, to know if he was safe, if the family had survived the searches that surely followed his disappearance. But the man only shook his head. He stayed behind, said you'd make it, or none of it meant anything. The words hit him harder than any bullet. He sank to the floor, the weight of everything, fear, grief, exhaustion, pressing down until all he could do was breathe. Pierre lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward into the dark. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "you cross." That night, as Walker lay on the cold floor of the mill, the rain outside easing into mist, he thought about what it meant to owe your life to someone else, to strangers who risked everything not for glory or reward, but because they still believed a man's life was worth saving. He didn't know if Henri was still alive, if the farmhouse still stood, or if that little girl still drew pictures of men with wings, but he made himself a promise there in the dark. If he ever made it home, he would find them, no matter how long it took. Have you ever carried the memory of someone who saved you, even when they never knew it? Comment. I remember, if you've ever felt that kind of bond. Dawn came pale and empty over the river valley, a thin mist rising from the water like the breath of ghosts. The world felt suspended, as if time itself was holding still to see who would survive the day. In the broken mill, the resistance prepared in silence. Pierre checked his weapon. Marie tied her hair back beneath a scarf still damp from the rain. The Free French officer, the one they called Arnaud, unfolded a rough map on the table and traced a line with his finger. "Here," he said softly in English, "beyond the ridge, fields, then a road. The other side is free." The words didn't sound real. Free. Walker repeated them silently, tasting them, feeling the weight of what they meant. He had almost forgotten that the world contained such a thing. They set out just before sunrise, moving through the fog like wraiths. Every sound seemed magnified, the crunch of frost underfoot, the distant caw of crows, the soft creak of Pierre's boots. Walker's muscles ached with each step. His arm throbbed beneath the bandages, but he forced himself forward. The forest thinned into open fields rimed with ice. Beyond them, faint and far, was the line, where Allied troops were rumoured to hold ground along the Loire. Between here and there lay open terrain, crisscrossed by roads and watchposts. They would have to run it. Halfway across the field, the illusion of quiet shattered. A shout in German, sharp and unmistakable, tore through the air. Then gunfire. Bullets whipped through the mist, kicking up dirt at their feet. Pierre yelled for them to move. Walker ran, the cold air cutting his lungs like glass, the world exploding around him. He heard the thud of a body hitting the ground behind him but didn't dare look. The riverbank ahead was lined with willows, their branches like grasping fingers. They reached it and threw themselves into the reeds as bullets hissed above the water. Marie crouched beside him, blood streaking her temple. She gripped his hand and said, "Go, don't stop." He shook his head, but she was already pushing him toward the edge. "They need you to make it." Another burst of gunfire ripped through the air. She fell back without a sound. Pierre dragged him forward, both of them plunging into the icy water. The current seized them instantly, dragging them downstream. The world became chaos, mud, branches, the roar of the river. Walker fought to stay above the surface, gasping, choking, his limbs numb. When they reached the opposite bank, they collapsed among the reeds, coughing up water. The gunfire had faded. All that remained was the steady rush of the river and the low murmur of voices on the far side. Allied voices, English. It didn't register it. Then it hit him. They'd made it. He staggered to his feet, waving his arms, shouting, though his voice cracked to nothing. A group of soldiers appeared from behind a hedgerow, rifles raised. One of them called out, "Identify yourself." Walker tried to answer, but the words tangled in his throat. Pierre stepped forward, hands up. "He's American," he said. "Pilot." The soldiers hesitated, then lowered their guns. One of them, an officer, stepped closer, his eyes scanning the mud-caked figure before him. "Jesus," he muttered, "we thought you boys were all gone." Walker wanted to speak, to tell them about Henry, about Marie, about the faces that had carried him here, but all he managed was a hoarse, "They saved me." His knees buckled, and the world tilted into darkness. When he woke, he was in a field tent, warm for the first time in weeks. A medic was cleaning his wounds, speaking softly. Outside, he could hear the hum of engines, the distant laughter of men who still had reason to laugh. Someone handed him a tin mug of coffee. The first sip burned his tongue, and he nearly wept from the taste. He stared at the rising sun through the tent flap and felt both joy and sorrow in equal measure. He had crossed back into the world of the living, but part of him had stayed behind, buried somewhere in that wet grey country where courage had the face of strangers. In the days that followed, as he recovered, officers came to debrief him. They asked for names, routes, details about the resistance. He gave them what he could, but his thoughts kept drifting to Henri. No one knew what had become of the farmer or his family. Some said the Gestapo had swept through that region after the autumn raids. Others said a few villagers had fled south. Every rumor felt like a blade twisting in him. At night, he lay awake listening to the low hum of trucks, wondering if he had traded their safety for his freedom. When his unit finally flew him back to England, he stood at the edge of the airfield, watching another bomber take off into the grey sky. The sound of the engines filled him with something almost sacred, grief and pride intertwined. He realized he no longer believed in clean victories. War didn't end, it just changed its shape. But he made himself another quiet vow. If the world ever gave him the chance, he would return to that small patch of France and find the people who had risked everything for a man they didn't know, not to repay them, because such debts could never truly be repaid, but to bear witness. Sometimes survival is not a triumph, but a responsibility. If you've ever lived through something that demanded you carry someone else's memory, take a moment, share this story, let it breathe beyond you. The war ended not with fanfare, but with silence. When the guns stopped, the absence of sound was almost unbearable, like the world had forgotten how to breathe. James Walker came home in the summer of 1945, one of the lucky ones, or so everyone told him. The small Ohio town where he'd grown up hadn't changed. The same brick post office, the same church bell, the same long stretches of road lined with maple trees that blushed red in the heat. People smiled when they saw him, shook his hand, told him he was a hero. He nodded, thanked them, said the words they expected, but inside he felt hollow. The world around him was loud and bright, and he didn't know how to live in it anymore. The first night back, he couldn't sleep. The sound of the train outside his window reminded him of artillery. The smell of engine oil made him flinch. He sat on the porch until morning, watching the sky lighten and wondering if anyone back in France was still alive to see it. His mother cooked every favorite meal she could remember: fried chicken, biscuits, sweet corn from the garden, but he barely touched them. His father tried to talk about the war in the way men do, nodding gravely, asking about missions, about flying. Walker answered in fragments, never mentioning the crash or the faces of those who died above the forests of France. Some stories, he decided, had to stay buried, or they'd devour everything else. The girl he'd left behind came by once, her hair shorter, her smile more cautious. They talked for an hour on the porch about simple things: the county fair, the harvest, the new radio station from Cincinnati. But there was a distance between them that neither could close. When she left, she kissed him softly on the cheek, and he realized that whatever had connected them before the war had vanished somewhere between the skies of Europe and the mud of the Loire. Days became weeks. He took odd jobs, painting barns, fixing fences, but the restlessness never left him. The noise of hammers, the shouts of men, even the rustle of the wind in the trees could send him spiraling back to the sound of engines or gunfire. He started walking at night, wandering the fields until the stars blurred above him. Sometimes he stopped by the river, staring at the reflection of the moon in the water, thinking of another river far away, one that had nearly claimed him. He'd pull from his pocket the little drawing the child had made, the man with wings, the farmhouse under the sun, and unfold it carefully, its edges worn and fragile. It was all he had left of that life, that promise he'd made to remember. In the fall of 1946, he finally wrote to the American embassy in Paris. The letter was simple. I was hidden near the Loire by a man named Henri Duval. I owe him my life. If he or his family are alive, I need to know. Weeks passed before a reply came. The envelope was thin, the paper official and cold. The message said that the Duval farm had been destroyed in a German sweep late in 1944. No records survived. No living relatives were listed. He read the words again and again, as if reading them differently might change their meaning. That night, he sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, the letter trembling in his hands. He felt the weight of it, the guilt, the helpless gratitude, the hollow ache of knowing that the people who had given him life had lost theirs because of it. But something in him refused to accept that silence was all that remained. The next spring, he sold what little he had saved and boarded a ship bound for Europe. The war-scarred continent he returned to was both familiar and foreign. Cities rebuilt over ruin, faces lined with weariness, but still alive. He travelled south by train, the countryside rolling past like a half-remembered dream. In France, he found the air different, the smell of rain and soil sharper, the light softer somehow. He followed old maps, old memories, until one evening he reached the edge of a small village near the woods where he had once fallen from the sky. There was no farmhouse where he remembered it, only the outline of stones hidden beneath tall grass. The field was quiet, except for the sound of wind moving through the trees. He stood there for hours, tracing the shape of what had been walls, imagining the glow of candlelight, the faint sound of a child laughing somewhere inside. He knelt, pressing his hand into the earth, and for the first time since the war ended, he wept, not the restrained tears of a soldier, but the raw, unguarded grief of a man who had carried too much for too long. He didn't know if it was mourning or gratitude, only that both felt the same. When he finally stood, the sun was setting, turning the horizon gold. In that light, he could almost see them again, Henri by the door, Claire by the hearth, the child holding her charcoal drawing. He whispered something he couldn't later remember, something between a prayer and a promise. Then he left a small token on the stones, a pilot's insignia from his jacket, and walked away without looking back. Some debts couldn't be repaid, but remembrance was its own kind of faithfulness. If you've ever carried the weight of gratitude you could never return, take a moment to share this story forward, because memory, too, is a kind of rescue. Years passed. The war receded into history, its memories sinking beneath the noise of new beginnings. But for James Walker, the past never left. It lingered in the corners of quiet rooms, in the smell of rain, in the way engines echoed across the distance. He married eventually, someone kind, gentle, who never asked too many questions about the things he didn't say. They built a modest life on the edge of town, raised 2 children, and tried to fit themselves into the rhythm of peace. He taught at the local airfield, helping young pilots who would never know the terror of flying through flak. On weekends, he tended the small garden behind his house, hands in the dirt, eyes often drifting toward the sky. Time softened some things, but never erased them. The drawing from the Duval child stayed in his wallet until the edges turned to dust. It was 1959 when the letter arrived. The handwriting was French, careful but unsteady, as if written by someone unused to words. Inside was a single page, creased and yellowed by travel. "Monsieur Walker," it began, "if this name still belongs to you, please know that my mother asked I write before she passed. My name is Elise. I am the daughter of Henri Duval. My parents spoke of you often, even when we had nothing left. They said you were kind and brave, and that your name was the reason we kept believing the world could be better again. My father did not die in 1944, as the reports said. He survived the raid and lived quietly near Lyon for many years. He always hoped to see you again, but the war made ghosts of us all. He is gone now, but I thought you should know. He never regretted helping, not once. He said you reminded him that courage was not only for soldiers." Walker read the letter twice before he moved. His hands trembled, his chest tight. The words blurred, not from age, but from tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. All those years, he had carried guilt like a shadow, believing their kindness had cost them everything. And yet, somewhere in the wreckage of Europe, they had found life again. Henri had lived. The little girl had grown up. Gratitude and grief twisted together in him until he couldn't separate them anymore. He sat for a long time at the kitchen table, the letter open before him, sunlight falling across it like something sacred. A month later, he returned to France. The journey felt different this time. No urgency, no fear, only a quiet reverence for what memory could still give. He found Elise in a small village outside Lyon, running a bookshop that smelled of dust and coffee and old paper. She recognized him the moment he stepped through the door. They didn't speak at first. She simply walked to him, eyes shining, and took his hands in hers. For a long while, they stood there in silence, surrounded by the whisper of pages and the soft ticking of the clock. When they finally sat, she showed him a box, her father's things. Inside were faded photographs, a few medals, and a piece of cloth so familiar it stopped his breath. Part of his parachute, folded neatly, still bearing the stains of earth and rain. Henri had kept it all those years. He said it reminded him that even in the worst darkness, Elise told, the sky could still bring someone good. Walker spent 3 days in that village, listening to stories of Henry's quiet life, the years he had worked as a carpenter, the way he'd helped rebuild homes after the war, the orchard he had planted behind his house. Elise showed him the old pilot's insignia he had left on the ruins of the farmhouse. Henry had found it, she said, when he returned months later. "He said you kept your promise," he whispered. On the final evening, they walked together to the river. The air was cool, the light gold and soft. Walker knelt and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers in the current, watching them drift away. "He saved my life," he said quietly. Elise shook her head. "No, you saved each other." When he left France for the last time, he carried the letter and the piece of parachute pressed between the pages of a worn journal. On the flight home, he looked out the window as clouds unfurled below, endless and white, and for the first time in decades, he felt something like peace. The war no longer seemed like an open wound, but a story that had found its ending. not in glory or vengeance, but in the fragile mercy of remembrance. Years later, when his children found the letter after he was gone, they framed it beside a photograph of a man standing in a field of ruins, sunlight breaking behind him. And below it, in his handwriting, they found a single sentence: "No act of kindness is ever truly lost." If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe, because every memory we keep alive keeps someone's courage from disappearing.